Scholar Hour. I'm Christina Joy, and today we are here with Briana A. Thomas. And Briana Thomas is the author of Black Broadway in Washington, D.C. And we're going to read her bio right now. So Briana A. Thomas spotlights the Black history of U Street in her debut book with a compilation of community storytelling, memory-jogging artifacts, and thoughtful memorabilia. Briana has been published in Washingtonian Magazine, the historic Afro-American newspaper, and the Washington Post throughout her journalism career. Briana earned her master's in journalism from UMD in College Park and a Bachelor of Arts in English and Communications from Greensboro College. Briana is the co-pastor of a Maryland-based multisite church, Open Bible Ministries. Welcome, Briana.
Did you say amen? Praise him, Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to talk about the history of DC today, specifically Black history. And thank you for everyone that's here in person and watching online. I wrote the book Black Broadway, Washington D.C. So a little bit about the book before we jump into the full discussion. The book published at the start of last year. The foreword is written by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton because she grew up in the U Street area, and the epilogue is written by Dr. Bernard Dumchuk, who's the Ben's Chili Bowl historian. So the book itself really talks about the Black Broadway era, and when you think of Broadway, for those who are here in person, what comes to mind? Theater, right? A place in particular?
Chicago.
New York, yes. Okay, so theater, New York, right. So here in Washington, D.C., within the U Street corridor, there was Black Broadway. So it had the nightlife, the attraction, the theaters, the entertainment, the music scene, except for it was for Black people. So this is a time of Jim Crow laws and segregation where musicians, artists, and amongst so many other fields, career fields, but they were kept out of performing in different places. But on U Street, the theaters were unsegregated. So Black artists were able to perform, really start their careers, some being like Duke Ellington, who grew up right here in Washington, D.C. So that was the core of my book, Black Broadway. So it was home to more than 300 Black-owned businesses during that time, 100 Black churches. It was the place to be if you were a Black person. So, yeah.
Now that's a stark contrast for what U Street is like today.
Yes.
Even though some of those businesses are still there, like Lee's Flower Shop and Industrial Bank.
Yes.
You know, we got some OGs still holding on in DC, so we still got some Chocolate City history, okay? But they are trying very hard to erase it, but we're holding on strong. Okay?
Yes, we are.
So let's get it right into our questions. So why is local history important to you, and why should it be important to everyone, in particular Black folks?
So local history is important to me specifically because that's how my book even started. So my background is journalism. I was working on a piece to uncover the forgotten history of U Street, and it was highlighting some of the remaining Black-owned businesses, like you mentioned, Lee's, Industrial Bank, Ben's Chili Bowl, as well as Howard University and other community organizations. And out of that, it grew into a book after the photo story was published in the magazine. But I only was familiar with the history originally because of my grandmother. So I dedicated my book to my grandma, Evelyn Thomas, and yes, I'm now the favorite grandchild. But I dedicated my book to her because she passed on the oral history to me, because she spent a lot of time playing, and I mean literally playing, on U Street, going around, partying, having a good time. And when I was growing up, she would take me sightseeing, going to different places, and really pass on that history, or what I would prefer to even say is legacy. So why history is important to everyone, and of course not just me as being a researcher, is this famous quote that says, "What you do is your history, what you set in motion is your legacy." So when you share a story, right? When you sit down at the table at the cookout and you pay attention to the auntie that is just going on and on about back in her day, those are oral histories that really become generational legacies. So it's so important, especially as Black people and especially as young people, that we listen to what's being said to us, but also we're watching what's around us, because if we don't tell our story, who will?
I'll tell you who will, these white folks. And they'll tell it from their perspective, right? Like, you know, a lot of the books that we have in our shelves, even though we're, you know, we do our best to get as many Black authors in as possible, but a lot of the topics that people want to read about our history are written by white people. And it's in part because Black folks aren't necessarily published as frequently, but it's also in part because we don't necessarily know all these things that they have access to. They have more access to our information a lot of times than we do. I mean, except for us, you know, at Howard University across the street, you know, we got Founders Library and everything, but, you know, a lot of us don't have access to all this information that we would want to know about. And so white people end up publishing our books. So thank you for publishing this book, because this is very important. And
thank you.
So based on your exhaustive research on the history of Chocolate City, what might people be most surprised about? What surprised you most?
Okay, there were a lot of surprises because this was 5 years worth of research. So I started this in 2016, and as I mentioned, it published in 2021. And it's like, since the book is published, it's even more that I learned. Just meeting people that are like, hey, my great grandfather was such and such, and things like that. So a lot of surprising things, but I'll say this surprising fact, because August is Black Business Month. But by 1901, Washington D.C. had 1,000 Black-owned businesses, which to me was a shocking fact. And the reason I say that is, if there are any history buffs that are watching online or in person, we celebrate here the DC emancipation every single April, right? There used to be huge parades. Of course, the pandemic has affected that. But in 1862, 3,100 enslaved Black persons were free here in DC, which is why we celebrate it. We have the first free enslaved persons. Well, that happened 4 months before the Emancipation Proclamation is signed in 1863. Now, I put all those dates together because I said by 1901, we owned 1,000 Black-owned businesses. That's barely 40 years. And Black people were so resilient and brilliant and just, it's crazy. To me, those are the kind of things that are shocking and surprising, because you look at present day where Google will tell you where to find a Black-owned business, right? You see all these Buy Black and all these campaigns, and it's like, we've been doing this forever. And I'm glad that it's a resurgence of it, but those are the kind of shocking, surprising facts, just to see like really the strength and the character that we have, and the financial wealth. Because when I told this story, just to stick on the business point for just a moment, if y'all don't mind, but a lot of times, Black Broadway got the name for the entertainment, right? The music, the dancing, which is nothing wrong with that. We are very talented. We can sing. We can dance a lot better than a lot of people. However, sometimes that's only been the focus when you're talking about celebrating Black achievements. A lot of times the business aspect, the entrepreneurship is overlooked. So when I told this story, I wanted it to be clear that, like, hey, yes, we had the largest theaters. Yes, we had the greatest vocalists, but also, too, we opened schoolhouses, you know, and we opened businesses, and we had the Black dollar and Black wealth where people were becoming millionaires. So those are the shocking, surprising things that I found in my history. So I'll pass it, so I'll keep going.
I mean, DC has such rich Black business history in general. I myself, I'm a Black business buff, and like anyone who knows me here knows that since 2015, I've been on my Black business tip. And, you know, just 5 to 7 years ago, Googling Black businesses was not as easy as it is now. And even going, like, I had just graduated from Howard, and I was really fired up about finding Black-owned businesses, and I was just surprised that, like, Howard had told us, like, everything was, like, right here, you know? And and now, like, now it's so easy that it's laughable almost, like, but it's also, like, it kind of feels a little forced, and it feels a little pandery to the way that they're kind of pushing certain Black businesses and not pushing other Black businesses, and but like businesses like Sankofa and Lee's and Florida Avenue Grill and Industrial, they've been holding on for this long by the skin of their teeth. Like we've been holding on to our space in the city because we own our buildings, you know? And it's like, if we didn't own our buildings, we would have been kicked out along with the other waves of Black businesses that have been kicked out. Next door is Chuck and Billy's Bar and Lounge. Before he passed away, Chuck, I believe it was Chuck. Might have been, I always get them confused. But Chuck had told me and my colleague at the time that, like, you know, this whole street was full of Black-owned businesses.
Yes.
That bar next door is the oldest Black-owned bar in D.C. And thank God his son, you know, is still carrying on that legacy. But like, we would have lost it if he, you know, plenty of Black folks die and they don't have someone to leave their business to, you know. And it's so common for that to happen. Thank God that Lee's is a family-owned business, Industrial is a family-owned business. Like, all these businesses had someone to pass it down to, and if they didn't, they would not still be here. Right? So it's like capturing that fact that, you know, U Street was this huge Black business hub, and it's now whittled down to those few landmark businesses. Like, it's not something to sneeze at, you know? So can you tell us about some of the major players in your book? Like,
I'd love to. So I had mentioned Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington grew up right in the Shaw area off of T Street. You can still go and see his home. He also had a home in Georgetown too. But Duke Ellington specifically performed at the Howard Theater, the Lincoln Theater when they had the Lincoln Colonnade in the basement, which was a dance hall. So just a mention on the theater. So when the Howard Theater opened in 1910, it was the largest theater in the world for Black people. So this predates even the Apollo Theater, which is why I always make a kind of a little argument about the DC Renaissance, you know, being greater than the Harlem Renaissance, because growing up, you know, even in this area, you're not taught about a DC Renaissance. Most people know about a Harlem Renaissance, but a lot of the artists we're familiar with actually started or debuted right here in Washington, D.C. because they couldn't go anywhere else. Duke Ellington being one of them. Pearl Bailey is a singer. She actually coined the term Black Broadway. So many others. Zora Neale Hurston, Carter G. Woodson is a major player in Black Broadway history. He's literally the father of Black history. So he started the Journal of Negro History in 1927. It was his own publication. It was printed right off of 9th Street within the U Street Quarter. And why he's special is because we wouldn't be having this conversation literally if it wasn't for his contributions. When he was growing up, he was told that Black people didn't have a history, right? Outside of Africa, outside of enslavement, there was nothing special about Black people. He didn't agree with that. So he dedicated his life to recording and journaling the achievements of Black people, not just in DC, but all throughout the United States. And he published it in his own work. And then he took it a step further and he was like, hey, we should create a week-long celebration where we celebrate Black people and all the great things they've done. And he called it Negro History Week. Well, now we celebrate that every month, and every year in February, and it's called
Black
History Month. Exactly, right. So literally Black history was founded in DC. Like, you know how, like, the magnitude of that is crazy. Every time February rolls around, I'm like, do we even know what we're sitting around that Black history started here? From one person. And another person, I can't say one person actually, because shout out to Girl Power, But Mary Church Terrell is another huge U Street hero, is what I like to call them. But she was actually in that conversation of like, yes, let's create a week-long celebration to highlight the achievements of Black people. But she, her house, you can still see it. It's being renovated, but that's the LaDroit Park. And that's where she lived. I don't know if anyone has been there before. It's still a very beautiful community. But during this Black Broadway era, we're talking the early 1900s, this was a place where the Black and bougie lived. That's just how we're going to classify it. If you had money, right, if you were educated at Howard University across the street, you most likely lived there. It was where W.B. Du Bois would have said the talented 10th, right? This was the community. So she lived there with her husband. Robert Terrell was one of the first Black judges in D.C., and they were like a power couple. So Beyonce and Jay-Z of U Street, that was them. Like, I wish I could time travel and be around them because that's how major they were in the city. Now, she's one of the founding members of the NAACP, which a lot of people think that it was founded completely by men.
Right.
Which makes sense because we see throughout the civil rights movement that it's not till later on that people start to say, oh, women were there too. But she was there. And then she also founded the National Association for Colored Women, which would have been the counterpart to the NAACP. And she was a teacher at M Street High School. Now, M Street High School was the first school in America, not just DC, but the first school in America to admit Black students. The first public high school to do so. That school today is called Dunbar High School. It's named after the Black Broadway poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. So even DC has the first high school for Black students. So you see how major this history is. But as a teacher during that time, as a woman teacher, if you got married, you couldn't teach anymore. There's a whole nother spiel to that I won't get into. I know, it's crazy, right? It makes no sense. But her mentor was Frederick Douglass, who's another huge player when it comes to Black history in DC. And he was like, oh no, you need to continue in education. And she did, because she actually met her husband, Robert Terrell, at M Street. And she became the first Black woman to sit on a public school board in America. So Mary Church Terrell, like a huge hero, she did a lot of great things for not just DC, but for Black people all throughout the United States.
She's dropping gems on this. I didn't know all this. I'm like, wow. Like, it's really, it speaks to the fact that, one, I'm from Jersey, right? So, like, I've grown up in New York shadow my entire life. And I was always like, yeah, New York, it's cool, whatever. But when I moved here, I was like, as soon as I moved here and I went to Howard, I was like, the energy here is just different. It's steeped in Blackness. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't escape it. And that's why they're trying to eradicate it, because it is so entrenched in our roots. And the fact that there's, like, I didn't know that Carter G. Woodson was here when he founded Negro History Week. I had no idea. But that museum isn't that on 9th Street?
Talk about the African-American Civil War Museum?
No, not that one. There's a Carter G. Woodson museum, right?
Oh, yes.
So, do you know anything about that museum?
So, not the museum itself, but I do know of, like, an actual center that's over there. And then the former printing press itself isn't there. It actually used to be a Starbucks. So, that's an abandoned building.
It's his house.
That's what it is?
Yeah, they renovated his house.
Yes.
Okay.
It's not a museum, but it's like a center.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, I saw it.
And they have that statue of him.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have the huge statue there, but it's not.
This all makes sense now. I remember I walked by and I was like, what is this building? What is this center? And I had no idea how deep. I mean, I know Carter G. Woodson's deep, but like, I didn't know how deep he was here. And the fact that you're, illuminating this whole.
Yes, really good book too, by the way.
This book is about Carter G. Woodson here in Washington, D.C. Okay.
And the same publisher that published this book published that one too. It's really good.
Yes, this series. So you're within kind of this series of books about
local histories.
About local histories.
Yeah.
That's so dope. But you had also mentioned Mary Church Terrell. That wow, like wow. She reminds me. I had researched about Nanny Helen Burroughs.
Yes.
And if anyone knows anything about Nanny Helen Burroughs, she is a bad woman. Okay, she wasn't on this side of town. She was in Northeast.
Yes.
And her school was in Northeast, and she basically fundraised the money from the Baptist convention by herself, and nobody believed in her to make this training school for Negro girls, but she did it, and like she started co-ops with these girls, like she did a whole bunch of things with
and it was girls from everywhere, from international.
Yes.
Yeah, Puerto Rico, Haiti, they were flying here to DC.
Absolutely, they were, and she also went to M Street, I believe. Yeah,
she did.
Like DC history, like I want to let y'all know that we are sitting in the roots right here, for at least for Black America. Like we are sitting in history for real. Like people really don't understand how deep our Black history is in DC, and I mean, except for the people that live here, people who grew up here, and for folks who come from elsewhere, we just getting hip. We just getting hip. So, were there any scandalous stories that didn't make it into the book?
So I wouldn't necessarily say scandalous, but there was a lot of information that did not make it into the book. And I would say not really scandalous, but just like really cool narratives that if I could have made a documentary, they would have been perfect. Because, like if anyone that's here today, you're creative, everything is in a book. Some things is like, should be on film or should be a podcast or whatever. So that was kind of the process of even, researching is like, okay, who wants to read, like, can they read this? But yeah, I would say honestly, the biggest kind of like narratives that I wish I could have had a way to write it makes sense for this story was really just the community of U Street throughout the times of being Chocolate City. So Chocolate City, that DC got that name in the 70s by Parliament and Funk Band, who played in DC, played at the Howard Theater. They produced an album called Chocolate City in homage to DC because in 1970, the census stated that DC was 70% Black people. It's definitely not that number anymore, but that's how I got the name Chocolate City. So the community of DC looked totally different, right, than what you would see now. And because of that, if you can only imagine the stories, like, I don't know if you all have seen Superfly, like the original one from the 70s, and maybe you saw the remake that came out not too long ago, but those are the kind of narratives that I would get from people like pimps and just like, crazy stuff that I'm like, I'm not gonna put that in a book. But yeah, like from, the numbers guy and gambling and just like, it was a community. That's what it looked like at the time. So yeah, just imagine Superfly, but in DC.
I personally think DC deserves its own docu-series, just Chocolate City, what y'all didn't know. I don't know.
No, literally though.
Like, seriously, because what bothers me the most is that, yes, we are the nation's capital, but it's like DC's kind of like an afterthought, almost. Like, in certain conversations, like you said about Broadway, like, you think of Broadway or you think of the Renaissance of Black arts, you always think of New York. Yeah, and now, like, when we're doing cinematic things or we're doing any type of arts, people either go to New York or they go to California.
Yeah.
And it's like they're just drawing all of the talent that's already in DC away from DC, and it's like what we really need here in DC is a nucleus of our talent and an incubator of our talent to stay, but it's already here. It's been here for years. The Black businesses have been here for years. Like, yeah, we have more. I'm sure we have more concentrated, like, as far as like our area, because we're small. We're a small little city. Like we have a higher concentration of Black businesses still, even today, than most cities. And it's just nothing to sneeze at. I put on for DC. I ever since I left Jersey, I'm like, I ain't never looking back.
And I'll say to your point of kind of an afterthought, I think that is engraved in history though. So like even when you're researching DC, even to be chosen as the nation's capital, there was a fight about that because DC was already an afterthought. It's like, oh no, we'll do Philly or we'll do it in New York, right? I mean, it ended up still being DC, but even from its inception, it's always been kind of an afterthought, even right now as we're fighting for statehood, right? So this is not an abnormal thing that just plays into race in general. I mean, it's money as well. It's culture. There's politics more than anything, which has to do, of course, race underlying. But there's a lot of factors for DC being that afterthought. And I will say that one of the best compliments I've gotten about this book was from former Mayor Sharon, and she had said this about my book when she read it. She was like, I really like how your book highlights the people. Because when you think of DC, especially if you're not from this area, it's, I want to see the monuments, right? The memorial, and I want to sightsee at the National Mall, which is great. But it gets so overlooked because of the politics and because of downtown and the White House that often when you're talking about the history, or you miss the people. Like there's neighborhoods and residences and businesses and all of those things. So I think that as long as you mentioned a nucleus, people keep coming together, keep creating, keep making DC bright and colorful. Like look at all the murals. Those are to point and be like, hey, we're here. You can go other places, but look what's already here. So
that is so true. Like we're like, yeah. When I came down here in high school, we did the whole monument tour. We did the Holocaust Museum and, all of the things. It was like, I had, I was just like, oh yeah, this is cool. It's DC, whatever. And then when I came to visit Howard, that was when I first got a taste of like what the people are like and what the energy is like.
Yeah.
And it's like, and now after living here for over a decade, the first thing I say when people come to town is like, hello, people live here. Like, they don't recognize that people live here and that they're blocking up our streets for XYZ, or they're doing this thing downtown. And so they got to take, create a new traffic direction or whatever. And then, or the president just decides to stroll out of his house. So everyone's got to wait, I'm like, people live here. Okay. It's like they don't even think about the people that actually are here. And so everyone else is just like, yeah, it's DC. It's a very interesting paradox, that I would say. Like, because when you think of New York, people do think of the people. People think of the neighborhoods. People think of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Bed-Stuy. Like everyone thinks of neighborhoods. And if you're thinking of like Times Square, like that's the ritzy, public facing New York, but they still think about the neighborhoods. People don't know what DC neighborhoods are, like unless you live here. I tell people I live in Anacostia, and they're like, what? What's that? I'm Frederick Douglass's neighbor, okay? Like, okay, he's down the street. Like, and mind you, that is such an overlooked thing too. Like the fact that we have all these houses here. Frederick Douglass's house. If y'all haven't been to Frederick Douglass's house, go to Frederick Douglass's house. Take the tour.
It's closed right now though, but it'll be back.
Is it? Why? I didn't even know that. No, I literally live right there.
Don't go right now, but it will be back.
But you should, when it's open, do it, because it's like $1. I'm like, it's amazing, okay? And Frederick, he was getting it. Like he was lifting weights because people would throw rocks at him because they was like, yeah, like you're black and we don't like you and all that woo woo. But Freddie's for the people. So your book centers on the U Street area. But does it touch where we are right now, Georgia Avenue, Northwest?
Yeah. Of course. So it does touch where we are right now, and even kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying on the difference of really neighborhoods, and people don't know the neighborhoods and all that. It's kind of the geography as well of DC, right? Versus if you go to New York, people are like, oh, what block did you grow up on, right? It's like, if you're in DC, it's like, oh, what high school did you go to? There's a difference in the way DC itself is created, the actual geography and mapping that goes all the way back to Benjamin Banneker, which has to do with Georgia Avenue Banneker School. But yeah, it goes back to how DC was formed from the beginning, to where it's always been a city within a city, especially for Black people. In fact, that's what U Street was called, because you have these little clusters or nucleuses within a larger community. Versus if you go to another city, and even with a community of colors, it's still more separated by, this is a neighborhood, this is a street. Versus in DC, it's just like everything's kind of thrown into one, and then we have it going in a circle. So things are separated based on landmarks. Versus when you go to other places, they're separated based off actual, from this corner to this corner. It's very different. And even in going to other cities, it's nothing like it. And I tell people all the time, like, you're never going to see what you can see here in DC, where you can have multi-million-dollar condos on one street, and then across the street, you see people that are without a home, right? If you go to other places, it's like, oh, we're going to keep everybody, all poor people can stay in this spot. We're going to have everybody with money on this spot. But DC's not like that. And because of that, it's easy to be overlooked. Because I see the condo, I don't see this person. Anywho, that's a separate spiel. But, because I'll write a paper on that. But Georgia Avenue specifically, and even talking about geography, because of the way that DC is connected, everything runs into the next thing. So it was impossible to talk about U Street and not mention 7th Street, right? Or I can't say the U Street corridor and not mention 14th Street, where you had the 1968 riots, I would say a rebellion, but it was so connected to U Street because it's literally up the street. That's what we say here, right? Up the street. So Georgia Avenue is one of those places connected to Black Broadway that's literally up the street. So you have Howard University, which plays a huge part. I have a whole chapter dedicated to Howard from its establishment in 1867. And you mentioned Black people kind of keeping the talent here or staying here. That's what Howard did. So Howard created a huge drawing of Black minds and Black educators to Washington, D.C., and a lot of them stayed because they couldn't go elsewhere. So you had people with PhDs teaching at M Street High School because it didn't matter how smart you were. If you had the wrong color of skin, you still couldn't get a job. But in D.C., within this quarter, you could. So you have Howard University, and then you already mentioned there were a number of Black-owned businesses, hair salons, barbershops, cafes, restaurants, all up Georgia Avenue. And a large part of that wasn't just the residents, but also Howard. Because just like this bookstore, right, it was catering to the students and the Black students that were attending Howard University. So one place specifically, the Cardoza sisters and their hair salon. So when I don't have like a full history of that in my book, but a lot of women interviewing them from like longtime residents would say, yeah, I used to get my hair done, by the Cardoza sisters up Georgia Avenue, Howard Manor. So Georgia Avenue played a huge part when it came to Black business and Black community, and it still does. It still does.
Absolutely, because people still call us at COPA, talk about where are y'all at? We'll be like, oh, Georgia Avenue. They say the real Georgia Avenue, or the new Georgia Avenue. I'll be like, the real Georgia Avenue.
Right, the real one.
And even back to Chuck and Billy's, Chuck was like named the mayor of 14th Street because originally his bar was on 14th Street, and after the riots, like he gathered up a whole bunch of people to basically serve the people that were devastated by the riots, and like gave out food and different things like that. And then he moved his bar over here, right next door to State Copa, and like and mind you, Trump wasn't even from DC. He was actually from Memphis, Tennessee, I believe. And
but that was normal.
Right. And it's like, transplants, especially that come to Howard and stay, like we end up like becoming a part of the community just as much as the Black folks that have been here like for generations. And it's really it's an amazing mix. I can see why people can overlook certain things about DC, because if you're in a certain circle, a certain sector of DC, if you're in the Congressional Black Congress, of it all, like if you're in the hill of it all, then yeah, you can look at DC and be like, oh yeah, it's just the politics and it's just the, it's just the White House, whatever. But if you're actually within the community, you develop a sense of like, no, this is where we are. This is our history. This is how, this is how we not only survive, this is how we thrive by, putting our resources into the people that actually live here and that contribute a lot to this community.
And to that point, I would say something that I didn't mention, but when you said contributing resources, it also made me think of the Black church too. So Black churches, as I mentioned, there were 100 within the U Street corridor, but they were a huge backbone for the community. It was a safe haven. Even if you look outside of U Street and you go to Georgetown at Mount Zion and having the oldest Black cemetery in Washington, D.C., because you didn't even have anywhere to bury your loved one if you were a person of color, right? So they created cemeteries and funeral homes and schools. The first school, as I mentioned, M Street High School, came out of the basement of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which is still around today. So it was this community feel where every avenue that you would need for daily life, Black people created for themselves. And they literally poured those resources back into the community. So yeah, we can use the church as a pulpit for activism, but we also gonna make sure y'all learn how to read in Sunday school, right? And and we're gonna have a bake sale too. Like all of these things that continue to build up the community. And sad to say, when you have business closed down, when you have desegregation and gentrification and people can't afford to live here, they take their stories, they take their businesses, they take even their worship, right, out. So you have churches that close down, but if the church was supporting the community, and I'm wondering, why does it seem like the houseless rate is going up, or I'm seeing things that are different? Because you took the resource out, right? Even on Georgia Avenue, Elder Lightfoot, he had his founded the Church of God, and he opened Happy News Cafe that fed like something crazy, like it was like 1 million people or something. The numbers in my book, but he would charge people like a penny for a plate of food. But imagine removing a resource that heavy, right, from the community. It makes a difference. So I think when we talk about change and how things evolve over time, it's not just one thing where I can point a finger and say, oh yeah, they shut us out of here, shut us out of there. It's a domino effect of things that when you remove pillars that are in a community, it really does change everything. But that church that I mentioned, Elder Lightfoot's church, is still actually off of Georgia Avenue. The name has changed, but it is still around. Yeah.
That's deep. That's those unintended consequences that people be talking about when you think about how communities change. And people think that gentrification is a double-edged sword, because at the end of the day, yes, you want things updated, yes, you want things restored, but it's like once you restore it to the point that the people who always lived here cannot enjoy the resources that are now being poured into the community, then who is it really serving? It's not serving us. It's serving the newcomer. It's serving the people they want here. And it's been happening in DC for years, like years upon years, because I was looking into even Anacostia. Anacostia was a white neighborhood. They moved Black people from Southwest to Anacostia just because they wanted to, but because the government workers, essentially that's when I think that was like right after the Great Depression, and there was like a lot of new government jobs that were put out there because there was a whole bunch of new departments. There was all these new bureaucracies and things like that. And so they were like, well, they need all those government workers to live close to the government. And so they took all the Black people that were in Southwest and were like, yeah, you guys can move over here. And then when it came to like urban renewal, oh my God, Chuck was all about urban renewal. He was like, essentially they told, after the riots, they told people that lived in Northwest that they could move back into their houses afterwards, after they, cleaned stuff up, but they moved them over to Southeast. And they never got to move back, obviously. So it's like, they've been doing this for years. And everyone talks.
That's the real scandal.
Exactly. That's
the real scandal.
They've been at Black Georgetown, like that happened way before that. So it's like, they keep doing this over and over again. And we've just, we're just reliving the cycle. But at the end of the day, Black people are still the majority here. I just want to let y'all know. It's like, we're like 46% or something like that.
No, not anymore. No. It's like right on the cuff. It's almost like half and half.
That hurts. That hurts. I mean, even in this last decade that I've lived here, I tell you what, Shaw Metro did not look like that. Okay, it was a hot mess. It was crazy. Like you could not even see. You had to sometimes you walk past Shaw Metro because it was wild. I'm just but it's the fact that this street has changed so much just since I came to undergrad here 11 years ago. Like, it's not that long, like this is, it's crazy. But
yeah, DC is the most on gentrification. I promise I won't go long on it. But it's the most gentrified city in America, period. So you do see this happening in all the Detroit, Chicago, LA. You see it happening other places, but DC itself is the most gentrified. From 2002 to 2016 was the actual polling date or them getting the statistic for it. But the population had went up 19%, but the white population was 202%. So that's been the major influx of the change of people that are here and also the change of income. And when that happens, I mean, that is what gentrification is, right? You have property value that goes up. So now taxes go up. And as you mentioned earlier, if you don't own your space, I can charge you whatever. So you can now be paying 3 times more than what you were paying just 10 years ago, but you're still making the same amount of money. How can you afford that, right? You can't. So in that point, and with gentrification being a two-edged sword, because I asked this question on people, and we're probably about to wrap up anyway, but it would always be, could there be another Black Broadway, right? Well, we see 300 plus businesses and all the Black churches and the nightlife and all of these things again, and the answer is usually no. There's not going to be another Black Broadway, but it doesn't mean that there can't be progression. It doesn't mean that the ideals or the spirit of Black Broadway disappears, right? So when you talk to the owners of the business that are still around, a lot of them say, we weren't afraid to grow with the times. We didn't say, look, if you don't look like us, you can't come in here. They were open or willing to be diverse. And it didn't mean that they lost their morals or values or spirit, but they were able to say, this is who we are. This is what we believe in. This is who we're going to support. You can come here. We're not leaving. And that is why a lot of the businesses have survived. Ben's Chili Bowl being one of them. They never close their doors. Riots, gentrification, you name it. But they are a hub for everyone, not just in D.C., but America, because they said, look, our doors are open because that is the spirit of the Black community, right? We're going to love you, but we are sure on who we are, right? And what we believe in. And ultimately with all of these Black Broadway heroes, the ones that are still here today, they really believe in community. So helping one another, uplifting one another, training the next person, not gatekeeping, which we see way too much of nowadays, especially in a career field. You mentioned how even publishing books, you see the disparity across being a writer, an author as a woman, especially being a young woman like myself. I know my voice is squeaky, y'all, but I'm not that young. I'm young, but not that young. But even that, like the backlash that you could face just from saying, oh, I want to write a history book as a millennial. It's like, girl, you ain't lived through this. I'm like, I know. That's why I'm trying to interview you. But those are the things that, like, what made Black Broadway special is because they passed it on. Versus like, nope, this is just for me. No one else gets to have this or know this. And I think that talking about moving forward and just something to take away is like, it's okay to be open. It's okay to share. And you giving away an information, you giving somebody history is not going to mean that now it doesn't exist. You're sharing it. And that's what allows people to progress. That's what allows businesses to grow as well. So that's my note on that.
Man. You ain't said nothing but a word. I'm just because even so, I had after undergrad, I had started a magazine with my peers called Our Black Book, and it was a magazine for Black-owned businesses, which is why I know so much about Black businesses. But like,
Congratulations!
I haven't printed in a long time. So, you know,
It's okay. He did it. He did it. That's all
I
that
did it. We trust. But like you said, asking these business owners about like the history or asking them about like other Black businesses, like particularly that conversation with Chuck, I will never forget because he was not trying to talk to us at all. he was like, what do y'all care about buying Black? What you mean? Like, he's like, what you talking about? You what you know about this? You don't know anything. Up and down this street, there were Black people all over the place. Now I don't see nothing. I don't see nobody coming down. He's like, I was like, you know, we need to help. Like, I tell y'all, before I had stopped eating chicken, they had some of the best wings over there. Okay, like.
So you ate some wings and soften them up.
Oh man, yeah. They had some wings, they had their potato wedges, man. They got some good food, okay? But he was like, yeah, like this street don't look anything like it looked when I opened over here. Like it's crazy. He said it makes me so sad that our people don't own businesses no more. And it's like, yes, we do, but you know, for him to see that to what it's down to now is a stark change, and it made me sad to know that there was all this here, and now it's like it's a shell of what it was, and it's like me coming from my little suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. I'm like, this is the most Black people I've ever seen in my life. Like, what are you talking about? But, you know, like it was normal here, and the fact that you know it's just dwindled down to a shell of its former self.
But it's not over though.
It's not over. The fight is not over. And that's why it's like, it's important that Howard is still across the street, no matter how much of it they try to sell off. I digress. Because it does bring Black folks to the city in droves. Like, and a lot of us do end up staying. You can't go anywhere without running into a Howard grad, like, period. Like, the end, like, bar none. And it's like, not just, you know, recent Howard grads, like people who've been here 20, 30 years, like,
oh yeah,
you know, like decades, like have now had children here, you know, like doing it all over again, like having more bison babies go to Howard, okay? Like we have a space here, and I wish we would recognize and claim it more. And I know that the Black folks that are from here, the DC natives, all probably feel this way, like that they're not an afterthought. They're important, and our businesses and all of our history, it's important. And if we don't know how important it is, then it's just gonna fall away, and they're just gonna say, "Oh yeah, like." Let's support this particular Black business because they have aligned with this corporate entity. Like, no, like, no, we don't have to align with corporate entities. We've been supporting ourselves since enslavement. We've been supporting ourselves since before we got here. So it's just like the mentality that goes along with everything that has happened to us is so detrimental to our survival, to our growth, really. So how can the average person get involved with historical research and documentation?
So first I would say, get out, see what's around you. So take a walking tour with me. So is anybody a writer? Writing? Okay, great. Kinda sometimes thinking about it? All right. Well, any kind of creative field, music, art, yes? All right. I say all that to say, you never know where your creations will take you. So, as I mentioned, I was not a historian or an author. I was a journalist. And I covered crime in D.C. for a very long time. I won't say very long, because some years. Because very long could be like 20 years. I'm 29, so no. Oh, that's 29 too? Yeah, I turned 29 last month. Shout out to the cancers. Anywho. So, yeah. But I did cover crime in D.C. for a while. Switched gears a little bit. Wanted to do more positive stuff. Highlight Black people in a more positive light, specifically in this area. But that took me to the book. And the book has taken me to be a licensed tour guide, because maybe you're not about to sit down and read 200 pages. And don't raise your hand if you're not going to read my book. Maybe you won't, but you might take a tour, right? A 2-hour tour, see what U Street was. And so many people that got the book were like, we want to see the places. So I learned how to be a tour guide. And I love it, actually. So this is my first summer going independent. So if you're interested in learning more about the history, want to document it, take some notes, like see what used to be, see what's still around. I do tours every single weekend. If you already have my card, it's just that little QR code. Scan it, it takes you right to the site. So I would say, first off, get out in the neighborhood, because there's so much history around. There's plaques, places. You can take self-guided walking tours. Look up cultural tourism if you want to get out on your own without me and my squeaky voice. That's perfectly fine too. I just think that you should learn the history, especially if you're new to the area. You have to know what's here. It's important, and it's also inspiring. So the other thing is good old-fashioned libraries. I know they might be out of style. We have a lot of digital things, but libraries, bookstores like the ones we're in, pick up a book, read it. And when it comes to researching and documenting too, I already mentioned this, but the other thing is just like oral history. So family members, there's so much history that's right within our reach, and a lot of times we don't learn it until it's too late, right? Until loved ones have passed on or whatever. But while you still have certain people in your life that are older than you, it can pass on those histories, that wisdom to you. Take it in, because that's a huge way of documenting the story. So the back of my book is called The Voices of U Street. I wanted this to be the title, but my publisher was like, no. So we went with Black Broadway, which I'm glad, because I think that was a good title. But the reason I wanted Voices of U Street to be the title is because I am a millennial telling a history that's way older than me. So it was impossible for me to document, research, and then tell a story from my perspective. I didn't live through most of this, right? But I did do a lot of interviewing, going to a lot of different places, talking to residents, talking to people at Howard, politicians, you name it, so that way they could tell the story. And that's why it's called The Voices of U Street. So that goes back to the strongest documentation and research you're really going to have is that firsthand knowledge that passes it directly from one person on to the next. Because when you think about what you read in a book, how do you think it got there? Somebody had to tell somebody, and they wrote it down. So that's what I say. Get out in your community, and also just listen to the loved ones that are around you, especially if y'all are in school, y'all ain't home. If they're calling you up and you on the phone a little too long, they go, I'm telling you, those stories will be so pivotal in your life later on.
That's so real. I learned more like talking to folks in DC about DC than like I ever learned in any history class, like at all. Period. Like there's just things that people know that that history doesn't always capture
Yes.
it. Like, especially because we're not the ones publishing history books. Okay,
Yes.
like especially not textbooks in particular. We're just not. that's a whole other conversation. Don't get me started. But oral history matters, like for real. You know, listening to the elders matter. You know, as long sometimes they be dragging on. I know, but you gotta like there are nuggets. There are nuggets, and you gotta pay attention to those nuggets because they really do know like what happened, and they have, as long as their faculties are still in order, they can remember it pretty well. So like,
And ask questions. Just
Yeah.
ask questions.
ask questions because they are ready to talk. Okay, like they want somebody to ask them what they was doing in high school, or where did they go to college, or what was it like when you were growing up here. Like they're ready to talk about that stuff. I want to open up the floor to questions. Do y'all have any questions?
Okay. Yeah, all right. You got it? Okay, so my question would be, I'm not from here. So when I came here, I appreciate how you brought up the people, because that was something that was integral to me. But I felt the conflict and still feel the conflict to this day, because a lot of people would say DC is like this beautiful place. But for me, when I walk down every street, I see a homeless epidemic.
Yeah.
And that jeopardizes the safety of a lot of our people that are around here. You know, shootings like pretty much dang near every week or every other week. So when it comes to this beauty that people talk about, it seems a bit contradictory because it's more focused on places than like culture. So how would you describe navigating, or how would you describe the best way to navigate this kind of environment that you want to kind of bond with, but you feel the culture is kind of not what the history shows? That's a good
Where are you
question.
from?
Columbus, Ohio.
Okay. Now that's a great question. That's a really good question. I think that to answer that, because for the most part I've lived in this area outside of when I went to school in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is nothing compared to DC. No shade to anybody from Greensboro. Had a great time there. Great time. Maybe too much fun. Right through 18. But anywho, I think that when you're coming into any new space, it's hard to adjust no matter where you are, because one, you probably don't know the history, and the culture has changed from what the history once was anyway. So I think specifically here and navigating it, you have to find the safe space that matches with your energy. So I'm not a poet, right? I'm not an artist. But if I were, there are different places in DC that I could go and that I could hang out, where I would find like-minded people that know that culture of DC. But because I'm not, you know what I mean? I don't need to be there, but I feel you can if you want to, whatever. But I say that until you get adjusted. And then when you find like your safe space in your safe community, that's when you can branch out and be all over the place. But I do think that that's a good way to navigate, is find your own little tribe, like find your community. There could be other people that are from Ohio, like you, that are like, oh, this street look a little sketchy. Because I get what you're insinuating, because that's real. That's the real culture of DC. That's not anything to overlook, right? These are the things that we vote on to try to stop, to get crime down, to change this policy, to why does the low income spots of DC look like that? So these are real narratives of DC that's true to the culture. However, it doesn't mean that you can't find a place for yourself here or enjoy yourself while you're here. So that's my advice. I would get into a space that matches you. You don't have to fit into the entire culture of DC. Just start with your place. Does that help?
No, that's good.
Okay.
And
And if there isn't a space, create one.
that, and to your point, also learn about why there are so many homeless people or houseless people in the area, or like why there's so many mentally ill folks like living on the streets. Because like a little bit of DC history, like St. Elizabeth's was like one of the only mental hospitals here, and then they shut it down.
And shelters.
And the shelters. So it's like they shut down the only mental hospital in the city, and so now all of those people who were in that mental hospital were effectively removed and are houseless now because there's nobody checking for them. And there are people checking for them because there's plenty of organizations here that do great work and are trying to help those people. But at the same time, it's like we have people like Mayor Bowser who say they want to eradicate homelessness, but they are actively making it harder for homeless people to live and find resources, like kicking them out of Franklin Park or like kicking them out of under the bridges in Northeast, like the K Street area, putting those little like these
Bars on the bench.
yes, those bars on the bench, like things like that, so that they can't sleep on the benches. Like they're trying to eradicate homelessness just by pushing them out of DC, period. So it's like it's pretty jarring, I would say, when you coming here and you move here and you recognize how stark the contrast is, that there's huge amounts of wealth here, and then there's poverty, like extreme poverty that's right in front of your face, and you're like, how do I navigate this? But you have to realize where it's coming from. It's coming from these policies that people are making and thinking that, oh yeah, this is helping the city, but it's not really helping the city. It's helping certain people in the city who have certain interests, and it's not actually helping like the people that need to be helped.
That helps a lot. It's definitely been more of kind of the conflict of like coming in and conscious enough to know a little bit about the history and the culture that you're getting into, but then running into this culture that's almost a normality, and that being in conflict with the ideal of the people that you would be kind of joining with, So it's like sensitive to suffering, and can't just overlook certain things. So it's navigating that, but definitely that feedback definitely is more than.
Yeah, and it's not just here either. Even in Baltimore, like I went to Baltimore for ASB, Alternative Spring Break in Howard, and it's the exact same, if it's not worse, in Baltimore. Like
They've done a lot of renovating in Baltimore too. But I would say the other thing, and especially if you're a student here at Howard or all of that, I think that, and this is a little church quote, but I would say it anyway. But a lot of times your misery is your ministry. So like you may come into a situation being from Ohio, coming to DC and be like, this ain't normal. You know what I mean? It stands out to you for a reason. And sometimes the navigation isn't about fitting in. Sometimes the navigation is like standing out. Like that's what made Black Broadway what it was. You had people that said, this isn't normal. Me not being able to sit next to somebody because of the color of my skin isn't normal. Because all kinds of laws and things that change is because somebody said, this is the normal culture, but I don't agree with it. So I think that's another thing too, just like, and navigating your space and even the community here. If you see something that stands out that's like, this ain't right, find your avenue of how I can help it. How can I change it? Who can I connect with that I can get to making a difference, especially when you have the resources of being a student. The world is your oyster at that point. I know my older sister used to tell me this is an oral history I should have listened to. She was like, these are the best years of your life. And I was like, no, really. College it is, because you're just so free and you have the opportunity to make the mistakes. Don't make a lot, but you have the opportunity to do so. So I'm gonna wrap it up because I think we don't win over time. Know what time it is.
Oh, no.
But I say all that to say, like, look, if it's something that's bothering you, that's how this became a book. Because I was just documenting history and collecting old photos and asking people, oh, tell me about this time. And I was like, it's not normal that there's only 3 businesses that are still left and they're worth 300. So somebody should say something or should write something. And maybe you are a writer, maybe you write a song or something. I don't know, but either way, if it's bothering you, don't overlook it, because maybe you're a freshman now, but by the time you get to senior year, you can start that organization, because there's charities and nonprofits that are also losing funding. So when we look at the population, when you look at the houseless community, the resources, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are being taken out of the neighborhoods. So maybe you start the next one. I don't know, but I'm gonna leave it there.
If anyone has a car in the Howard parking lot, they about to lock it up. That's our announcement. But I don't think anyone got a car here, but I had to say that. Yes, Ariel, give me your question.
Okay. So you were talking about W. B. Du Bois talked about the 10%,
Mhm.
and then you talked about how when you were coming across stuff, you didn't put in like the pimps and the people that was running the numbers. So I guess my question is, for me, like I also try to like do oral ethnographic stuff, especially with zero nursing. And in academia, I guess I want to like document the 9%ers. The folks that's not just like the kings, the queens, the Egypt, or the Frederick Douglass and stuff like that. Thinking about folks who had 80s, that's the crack era. Some folks had to go that way, you know what I mean? Or even Athena Shakur. Imagine like not just talking about her being a Black Panther, but she did, have that crack stuff too, because the trauma and the healing stuff. And I feel like when I'm in academia, even like with thesis, since you did college and stuff like that, the pushback is no, just do like a credible source instead of like actually getting this oral history. Even at an HBCU, it's a pushback of not doing that. So like, how do you think I should navigate that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's a pushback. I think that my background in journalism makes me super connected to oral histories, because as a reporter, all you're doing is retelling the story from the perspective of somebody else. So I was trained in school to be unbiased when I approach it. Even if I know it, I have to approach it in a way where you don't see that now though. I don't know what's going on with these journalists, but that's a separate thing. But you're supposed to approach it in a way that's ethical, to where it's not my story, it's their story. And I think that how to kind of navigate that in an academic way is, one, you should take those oral histories, but also, can you find a place where it's already been documented that you can connect to? Like, how can I fact check this? Such and such says, I grew up off of 14th Street. I lived 3 doors down. Well, does that even exist? There are still ways that you can bring it back to a professor and say, this is credible. I have the resources for it. Let me just take this story and this quote. So even when you're doing oral histories, because people lie. So there's still a fact checking process where I have to make sure that Susie isn't making this elaborate story about how she was the first whatever. But can I fact check this? Is there a document somewhere in the Library of Congress where she went to school? Can I see that she actually graduated here? So that's how I would navigate it. See what facts you can check within their story to qualify whether this is true or not. But don't give up on the oral histories. And I say that because even if you don't want to write, like, this is the age of streaming. So back just 10 years ago, people need content. So whether you about to make it on TikTok, like I'm in the process of getting the sponsorship now to make history. I wasn't on social media until I published this book. I literally was like a little introvert. But I say that to say that there's so many ways of storytelling now. So even if you're facing the pushback, just find a way around it, but keep those skills, because you can use it in another avenue that's outside of, writing a paper.
Oral history matters. Use it. Just cite it. They always say cite everything. Like you said, there's something in the written word that refers to what that person is talking about. Like, no matter what. I mean, unless they are lying. That's a whole different story. But like they maybe
the crazy stories.
Embellish it a little bit, like maybe they wasn't Ray Ray's first cousin. I don't know, but like maybe they was in the family tree. You know what I mean? Like there's ways to get around that. Because yeah, you're right. Howard's like, cite. You better cite, because it don't exist if you didn't cite it. But that doesn't mean that these stories don't have value just because they're not all written down yet. And I say that yet because you can write it.
That's a great question.
You have a question? I don't know. It seems like you got a question in your spirit. Maybe I'm just.
That's that embellishment. Go ahead.
We gotta fact check that
did have one. I think you were talking about gentrification, and I might have misheard you, but you said you were talking to somebody about like whether all of it was bad or like all of gentrification was bad. I just wanted to like elaborate on that point.
Yeah. So it goes, and people don't like to have this conversation, but it's real. Talk about the culture of DC. When you, and I do go over it in my book, but gentrification is like nail in the coffin, right? The city didn't change because former Mayor Anthony, who I have in my book too, was like, yeah, let's bring 100,000 new residents to DC. He exceeded that in 2003. But we see the effects of the city changing in terms of people of color moving out of the area back from desegregation. So when you have desegregation of schools in 1954, you have these civil rights laws and acts that are being passed. Black people now have the opportunity to go elsewhere. Versus Black Broadway was literally built because they could not go anywhere else. So it's these factors that happen. It seems like, oh, the last 20 years, everything changed. And it's like, no, this is a progression. And then you also have the metro construction. Metro construction starts in the 70s, doesn't stop till the 90s. Yeah. So a lot of the streets, a lot of the businesses, it didn't matter if your doors were open, nobody could get to it. Like there's pictures in my book of literally just pavements being ripped. It was a mess. Gated businesses. So Black businesses lost money and some of them had to close. And then I didn't even mention the 1968 riots, of course. So then you have metro construction. And then after that, you have recently, well, not recently, but in between that, when people say like the double-edged sword of gentrification is because the city did clean up with gentrification. Because during that same era of Chocolate City, you also have the crack epidemic. And you have a lot of Black people who had those jobs that she mentioned in the federal government. But then you had, working class people. We have this stigmatism of what somebody that is addicted to drugs looks like, right? But you have to take it back to that time. This is new. People don't know what this is going to do to them. It was crazy. It transitioned from this big heroin that happened, and then you transition to a new drug, crack, and it changed everything. Even Mayor Marion Barry, like that's a whole separate history of DC. But if you ask anybody from DC, within the Black community at least, they're gonna be like, that's my mayor forever because of what he did for the Black community. They could care less about the scandal of everything else. It didn't matter because during that time you could have been anybody and fall into the wrong thing or the wrong drug because the effects wasn't the same. You didn't know. Not making an excuse for it, but I'm just saying that's the real story. So you see these Black communities that are torn apart. You see now people being arrested, all these other things that happen. And so if you are a Black person in DC with the money to go elsewhere and you have, let's say, even children, the question becomes, why am I staying here? Why would I not go to Prince George's County, which becomes the wealthiest county for Black people, not in DC, not in America, for many, many years. It just changed last month to Charles County, actually. But why would I not go elsewhere? I don't want to raise my kids in this violence and drugs, and it wasn't good. So people that have survived, business owners and things like that, they're like, yeah, we're not a fan of people being pushed out, but I do like that the streets are clean. And I do like that there's not a shooting right out front. I do like that my business isn't being robbed. Even Howard University, I interviewed a number of faculty members that was like, this campus was a mess. That's the real of it. So that's, to answer your point, that's the double-edged sword. The problem is when you clean up a place in a community, why does that now result of pushing Black people out? Why can't you get rid of, because clearly you can get rid of crime. But it's like, who are you doing it for? Why can a community only thrive and be clean and garbage not everywhere and rats everywhere? I know I'm going on a rant, but why does, when those things happen, now I have to push Black people out of the area for that to take place? Because us saying, oh, it's impossible to get rid of this problem. It's not, because we see it happening. It's just, who are you doing it for? So that's the double-edged sword. Everybody likes nicer things, right? I like nice stuff. Can't afford a lot of nice stuff, but I like nicer stuff. The problem is, though, DC does look a lot better than it did when you're talking about abandoned buildings after the riots. The problem is, who does it look better for?
Exactly.
I hope I answered your question.
Went back to your comment about the metro. I remember people at Industrial Bank telling us, like, when we were doing the magazine, like, when U Street was, when the U Street Metro was being built, like, barely anyone could get into their bank. Nobody could get into Bank Chili Bowl. Nobody could get into Lee's. Like, everyone was, like, literally hopping around, like, just.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, you see what DC construction looks like now. Like, it's always a mess, and it's always disrupting the flow of traffic. It's disrupting neighborhoods. It's disrupting businesses. It's disrupting our business. Like, right across the street, there's something being built right now. They want to live here. Yeah. And they're taking up our parking. And it's like, there's already barely any parking over here to begin with. So how is that affecting us? But they don't care. It's not for us. It's for them. Like, even though technically it's partnered with Howard, but you know how Howard is doing with these little partnerships. I'm just saying.
Yeah, but DC has a lot of privately owned things, though. So even when I do my walking tours, people are always like, wait, what's in here now? Because you'll go to a historic house and I could be mid-tour and somebody walks out, with the dog. Like, I'm just trying to be in my house. But this is a national registered historic place with a plaque on it. But DC versus other places, a lot of the spaces are privately owned. So even if I say this is a registered, nationally registered place, you have to preserve it, it doesn't mean somebody can't move into it. So now there's a condo place or office space. And that makes a difference when it's construction and developers and things like that, because you may be preserving the actual building itself, but the space isn't really being preserved anymore. And that comes down to money also. And if you owned a $3 million home off of Vermont Avenue, I probably wasn't, I'm a history nerd, but if I wasn't, I probably do want a statue of Madame Lily Devontae outside of my house. I just paid $3 million. Like, no. But that's what you see in DC. So that's kind of the difference versus other cities. Even if it's spaces that should be preserved, you see the same thing happen now with Navy Helen Burroughs and her school. But it's like, it's a constant fight between who owns the property and who's trying to preserve the space for history.
What are they doing over there?
So that's been up for historic bid. So the trade school itself is registered as a historic place, but the surrounding campus isn't, which is, once again, so now you have a fight about a building versus a space. And that happens all the time. And that's a whole separate rant. But another thing is too, like, knowledge is power. So a lot of people don't know that. And I don't know if certain organizations also do the best job of telling people. So if you go to the National Park Service website and you're just trying to find information, it's hard to even find when do people vote on this, because they're open public bids. Anybody can submit testimonies to save spaces, but how do you even know how to participate in these things? So I think, like, just coming out on your Wednesday night, listening to us yap about DC history is a huge, kudos to all of you, because I don't know what I was doing in college on Wednesday night, but that's like a big deal, because this is how you get the education to know how to help save a space and really a community, because people are connected to spaces. Even when you think about where should I go, you think on it based on, oh, that's right there, or this coffee shop is there. So that's a long rant, but anywho.
Black folks tell directions by, by the shrimp boat. Like, if you don't know where the shrimp boat is and you lived here for X amount of years, you're like, you don't really live here. It's because that's on the other side of town. But it's like,
but even that changed.
Like,
10 years.
It's
the wharf
insane.
is $40 for parking. I'm like,
The wharf
it was nothing here.
Nothing. There was nothing there like
And now
5
you
years
want to
ago.
charge me $40?
Exactly. it's crazy, y'all. I want to let y'all know. It was just a fish market. There was just boats.
Yeah.
That was it. It wasn't all this, the anthem, all that. That came up within the last 5 years. Like, literally. It's crazy. But
Phones on 20%, by the way.
say what?
Phones on 20%, by the way.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate you. So I guess we done yapping for real. But thank y'all for coming out and supporting Scholar Hour. Thank you, Briana.
Thank you for having me.
Sharing your wealth of knowledge. First of all, I haven't even read this book yet, but I already know it's amazing. Like, buy the book, y'all. I know y'all students, but this is important. This is real history.
And I don't know if those copies are signed, but I can
She gonna
autograph.
sign them all.
Yes, I will. I can autograph these copies, and also too, if you didn't get one of my cards, I can give you one. But please connect with me on Instagram. It's just @ the Black Broadway. I always post like upcoming events, what I'm doing around, and hope to see you on a tour in the future. Or I do virtual tours too, so if you need a mental break when it gets cold outside, see me on Zoom. But y'all have a great rest of your evening.
I appreciate you.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good night.
Can I get a group picture with y'all?
Yes.
I didn't document a thing. I just realized.
Oh, yeah, this is Yeah, I'm
Okay.
gonna check them out.
What's his name? You think he can take it? Yeah.
Come out.
Come out.
Oh, man, I'm definitely gonna be there.
Could you come take a picture, please?
No.
Thank you.
He said no.